Okay, welcome everyone. Kalispera to everyone here with us, and thank you for weathering the two downpours we've had here in Athens today, unusually. And welcome to everyone that's online with us as well. Welcome to this year's Bader Archive Lecture. And just a little bit about the person who made this possible. So this lecture series for the archives at the British School at Athens started in 2009. And it was a platform to showcase all the research that's developed from the material that people come to see here in our archives. And in 2014, the series was reconfigured as the archive lectureship and is now supported by the endowment given to the school by the late Father Edward Bader. And Father Bader was a student at the school in 1965-66 academic session. He was already an ordained Catholic priest when he came to the school, but he was doing his PhD in art and archaeology in Cambridge. And so he came out to the British school, had such a wonderful time here and made lots of friends. And he always remembered these with quite a lot of fondness. And throughout his life, he wore many hats, including being a priest. And that was also being an archivist at some point. And that's why he wanted to give the money to the archives, because that was something he knew that was kind of underfunded and wanted to support that sort of research. So he was based at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and there he served as a priest and archivist, curator of the art and archaeology department they had, and as adjunct faculty, actually, in the archaeology department. So he wore many hats, I think a little bit like our speaker tonight. So this year's Bader Archive Lectureship is Dr. Senta German. She's an associate professor at the Department of Classics and General Humanities at Montclair University, New Jersey. She's received her degrees from Temple and Columbia universities, and more specifically, she received her PhD from Columbia in Aegean, Greek, and ancient Near Eastern art and archaeology. She's taught at Columbia University, New York University, and Rutgers, and she was also the Andrew W. Mellon Teaching Curator at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And these are amongst the many various adventures she's had in her career. Her work explores the intersection of art and ancient Greek society with specific attention to performance, gender, and the impacts of the illicit antiquities trade and forgery. And of course, restorations, which we're going to hear about tonight. She's published widely on these topics, and her most recent publication was part of the catalog of the Labyrinth, Knossos, Myth and Reality exhibition, which took place in the Ashmolean last year. And her contribution was reconstructing the Grand Staircase. So Senta first came to the British School before my time in the 90s. But most recently when I met her, we started contact in 2018 and about her current project that we'll hear about tonight. But due to scheduling conflicts and COVID, really, she was actually finally able to come in 2022 to do this research for tonight's presentation. The main objective now of this presentation and her research was the correspondence of Piet de Jong. And a lot of you, of course, know him probably very well because he was an architect and artist for the British School and the American School of Classical Studies from about the 1920s until his death in 1967. And in fact, he spent most of his career, de Jong spent most of his career in Greece, and his last years of his life were spent in Knossos, and he died there in 1967. And he left a bequest to the school at the time, and which made an extension to the Stratigraphical Museum, which he worked at, possible. So most of her research, most of Senta's research has been through the corporate records of the school. And I'm quite pleased about this because it highlights the great type of information that you can extract from the corporate records, which everybody thinks administrative papers are quite boring, but actually they have just packed with information. So conversations with Senta while she was doing it was always really fantastic because I don't get the time to read all the letters. So the researchers who come in to do this, it's great fun to just have them tell me what's going on in the archives. So I'm very much looking forward to this presentation and what she's developed from our research here in the archives. And so now I turn it over to Senta for her presentation, Piet de Jong and the Post-War Restorations of Knossos.
I'm so grateful for that kind introduction. Please. Oh, yes, that's a good idea. Thank you. And so grateful for the warm reception I have been given a few times here at the British School, and especially most recently with the illustrious new director. Here we go. When you visit Knossos today, the work of the site's restoration is overwhelming. Almost everything you see has been, here we go. Almost everything you see has been conserved, restored, or reconstructed, in many cases within a few years of its archaeological discovery, and in nearly all cases repeatedly. Arthur Evans, who uncovered most of the site between 1900 and 1930, quickly came to understand that restoration was essential because of the unique composition of its architecture. Knossos is mostly rubble construction with extensive use of delicate gypsum stone on walls and floors. And when its remains are not protected from the wet Cretan winters and hot summers, the growth of flora in the innumerable cracks and crevices begins to slowly destroy it. And then there are the tourists. It is reported that in 2023, Knossos welcomed 1 million visitors, a record, contributing 60% of the overall income of all the sites, all of Crete's museums and archaeological sites, earning nearly 11 million euro. Malia, Festos, Zakro come nowhere near these figures. It is what you can see and experience at Knossos today that is the main draw. Say what you want about Arthur Evans's restorations, and many have said quite a bit. He is owed a titanic debt of gratitude for them, offering so much wonder, delight, and revenue. Evans employed 3 architects in restorative work at Knossos, the last of whom was Piet de Jong, curator from 1947 to 52, during the complex and challenging post-war era. Of the 3, de Jong's work had by far the most lasting impact upon Knossos and is largely responsible for what the site looks like today. What I shall present to you this evening is de Jong's post-war restorative work at Knossos, almost entirely funded by the US Marshall Plan. Indeed, this restorative work was not only critical to the structural survival of the site, but also, together with American-supported restorations of other Greek antiquities, such as the Acropolis in Athens, an underappreciated but critical element in the first overtures of 20th century Cold War strategy. I will also show the crucial role that Nicolas Platon, effer of the Archaeological Museum of Heraklion, played in getting the funds to Knossos, which, wholly owned by the British School in Athens at the time, was not strictly eligible for Marshall Plan aid, and as a British excavated site, possibly the victim of American discrimination. As we begin, let us briefly review a bit about the history of architectural restoration at Knossos. Theodore Fife was the first architect to work at the site, employed from the first season of excavation in 1900 to 1904. Evans brought him on because of the unusual circumstances of preserved architecture at Knossos, spanning up to 4 stories in height. Fife's restoration work is characterized by the use of authentic Minoan materials, wood, rubble masonry, and ashlar blocks. He also built flat-roofed shelters for several areas of the site to protect delicate features and gypsum flooring. Some of his work lasted a long time, such as the roof above the throne room. Other work, such as his work on the grand staircase, suffered from the effects of the Cretan winters almost immediately. Christian Dahl was hired by Evans to succeed Fife, working from 1905 to 1910. Dahl was the son of a successful British architect, Charles Fitzroy Dahl, and in fact, the structural systems he employed at Knossos were based on techniques common in London at the turn of the century, where he had worked with his father prior to coming to Crete. Dahl used iron girders and brick vaults for reconstruction, rejecting Fife's use of authentic materials, seeing how badly they had failed. However, The ordering of prefabricated ironwork from Britain was expensive, and as a result, Dahl's restorations only occurred in areas in which it was essential. It was Dahl, not de Jong, who first used concrete in the restorations of the palace, although not for structural reasons. He used it in his stabilization of the grand staircase to square out the iron girders to look like wooden beams, as well as to protect them from rust. Dahl also built Evans's house at Knossos, the Villa Ariadne. And then comes Piet de Jong. His work can be broken down into two phases. The first, between 1922 and 1930, hired to deal with not only the damage and neglect suffered during World War I, but also to try, yet again, to reconstruct architectural passages in a truly enduring way. In many circumstances, Piet de Jong remade the work of Feith and Dahl. For instance, I will very briefly go through the case of the Hall of the Double Axes. So here we have a plan locating the Hall of the Double Axes, and then on the left-hand side, a drawing by Theodore Feith of the excavated remains. And here from the Evans archive, we have photographs of the excavation of the Hall of the Double Axes. Right, you can, in the right photograph, you can actually see the ground line. So you can see how the ashlar blocks, which locate a pier and door partition passage, are discovered for the second story. In an effort to preserve that architecture that was found, Theodore Feith elevates those blocks on, as you can see here, wooden beams. As we have learned, that doesn't work out so well. And then Christian Dahl replaces those wooden beams with with steel girders that are then packed with rubble. And then again, elevating those ashlar blocks, and then eventually squaring them out with plaster, creating, again, preserving that second story. Here is a drawing that Christian Dahl creates for a restoration of that space, which Evans does not execute. And then here, of course, are Piet de Jong's executions of that space. Here, I'm probably familiar with that here in the room turned the other way, seeing how he's, like Christian Dahl did, blocked out the pier and door partitions, but obviously in this case, roofing them. And here is a view of the roof above that space, showing those, again, pier and door partition ashlar blocks, indicating what the space above that would have looked like. After 1930, Piet de Jong was finished with his work at Knossos and became attached to the American School of Classical Studies at Athens excavations of the Athenian Agora as an artist and draftsman, as well as completing drawings for the publication of Carl Blagan's 1925 excavations at Prosimna. De Jong also continued work for the British School, completing architectural drawings for Humphrey Payne's publication of Perichlora, as well as working on plans for the extensions of the hostel and library. His last trip to Greece was 1939. His last trip to Greece in 1939 was cut short by the darkening war clouds over Southern Europe. De Jong took a position designing machine tools during the war, living in London, eventually returning to his Norfolk home in 1945. The war years on Crete were a bit more exciting. To quickly refresh our historical memory, Italy invaded Greece in October of 1940, attacking from Albania. After a routing of Italian forces by the Hellenic Army, Germany invaded Greece and Yugoslavia on the 6th of April, 1941. Despite the resistance of the Greek and Commonwealth troops, the German blitzkrieg was overwhelming, and Athens falls on the 27th of April, 1941. The Greek government actually having moved to Crete and staying for a moment in Evans's villa, the King and Queen. Not even a month later, on the 20th of May, the Germans launch Operation Mercury, the battle for Crete, not only to secure a foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also to prevent the British from using the island as a base from which to attack Axis forces, holding now much of the Balkans. Richard Hutchinson, the curator of Knossos prior to the invasion, leaves the island on April 30th for Alexandria to work in the War Office Middle East Intelligence Center, part of the substantial British forces stationed in officially neutral Egypt to protect the Suez Canal and British oil supplies. Before leaving Crete, Hutchinson gives the keys of the villa to the British consul in Heraklion. John Pendlebury, curator of Knossos before Hutchinson, now British vice consul in Heraklion, and critical in rallying militia forces to defend the island, is killed on the third day of the battle. The British forces on the island surrender in Rethymnon on the 1st of June. On the same day, Wehrmacht General Julius Alfred Ringel takes up residence in the Villa Ariadne, using it as the headquarters of the 5th Mountain Division. How did Knossos fare in the Battle of Crete and during the Nazi occupation? This is hard to say exactly. The long-serving staff of the villa, Manolakis Akoumenakis and Kostas Chronakis, stayed on to look after the estate, but Akoumenakis was killed in the first days of the Battle of Crete, and Chronakis left no narrative of his work. The few extant sources on this period nearly all reflect, however, the power and determination of Nicolas Platon to protect the archaeological heritage of the island. Indeed, it is clear that Platon almost single-handedly prevented wanton destruction and theft at Knossos and much of the rest of Crete. He also is one of the few sources on Knossos in Operation Mercury. He reports that during the heavy bombardment, the local population hid in the rock-cut Roman tombs in the west of the site, and that the remains were largely unscathed, possibly by virtue of Cretan militias guarding the ridge opposite the palace, following one of the last orders of John Pendlebury. As for exactly how the Nazi occupiers treated the site, Georgia Fluda has provided essential research and analysis, which I recount briefly here. General Ringel, Platon reports, quickly completed excavations near the area of Gypsades, and to expand the work, brought to the island Lieutenant August Schorgendorfer, an archaeologist. Perversely, Ringel and Schorgendorfer's illicit excavations at Knossos and elsewhere on Crete were heralded as a legitimization of the Wehrmacht's role in the protection of cultural heritage and a source of honor to the Reich. From October to December of 1941, Schorgendorfer and Ulf Janssen, the chief officer in charge of the Cretan Kunstschutz office, were ordered by Ringel to dig again at Knossos, and they excavate a Roman house above the north end of the unexplored mansion behind the little palace with a team of local workmen. And here is a photograph from the Bundesarchiv that lists a different excavation, but gives you a sense of what that work was like. Platon informed the Greek Ministry of Education of these illicit excavations, and they were shortly afterwards stopped. But what of the already exposed remains of Knossos under the Wehrmacht? No reported or description of the of the site or upkeep of it is available between 1941 and 47. However, Knossos was most certainly a popular point of visitation by the German military staff. And here, a couple from, again, the Bundesarchiv and a couple from private collections. I have put together some photographs of these, obviously, as you can see, are the Fallschirmjäger post-battle, apparently, 41, and some of the Kriegsmarinen, and from the Bundesarchiv here. Extraordinary. Indeed, by 1943, there were 75,000 German soldiers on the island, fully 1/6 of the population. This same year, reported in the Schweizer Illustriert Zeitung, October 27th, 1943, page 4, as well as actually also in the weekly arts magazine of the Pariser Zeitung, the daily paper of occupied Paris, German infantry battalions present Sophocles' Oedipus Rex on the steps of the theatrical area at Festos, which incidentally is incorrectly identified as Knossos in both press mentions. Festos' theatrical area offered a more substantial stage and seating, and perhaps this is why it was used. Indeed, many Wehrmacht troops were stationed in the south coast of Crete at the time in an attempt to intercept British naval craft, which were known to drop off agents and supplies there. If Knossos was used for similar theatrical or athletic practice, we do not know. Platon records that by the summer of 1944, the Germans belatedly cooperated in the official protection of Knossos by declaring it a neutral zone and appointing a committee to guard it. By September 1944, at which point the withdrawal of Wehrmacht troops was imminent, Michailis Akoumenakis, the son of Manolakis and the chief Greek-British resistance agent in Heraklion, used Knossos as a rendezvous point for his guerrilla forces in their plan to infiltrate Heraklion. On the 11th of October, 1944, The Nazis leave Heraklion, and the Villa Ariadne is commandeered by the British military mission headquarters by Lieutenant Colonel Tom Dunbabin, the senior British liaison officer with the Cretan resistance. Knossos and the villa were familiar to Dunbabin, as he had been assistant director of the British School at Athens in 1936 and took part in excavations at the site. To again review historical events which are likely familiar to most, by the second week of October, the German withdrew nearly entirely from Greece because of increasing pressure from Allied forces, as well as the Soviet invasion of Romania. Filling the political vacuum left in the wake of the withdrawal were Greek political parties and guerrilla bands, fighters who had been aided by Commonwealth troops, hoping for a future of self-determination. Of these groups, the Socialist National Liberation Front, or AAM, was the most popular, together with its military arm, the Greek People's Liberation Army, Hellas. The potential rise of political power of socialist groups was obviously a grave concern for Allied powers, especially the US and Britain. Indeed, in August 1944, Churchill had written to President Roosevelt, predicting that Athens and all of Greece would be seized by AAM and communist extremists when the Nazis left. Therefore, at the point of Nazi withdrawal, it is not surprising that direct, although largely covert, American attention is turned toward Greece. Rodney Young, an American archaeologist working with the OSS in Cairo, is one of the first Americans to enter the country in October 1944 and establishes an intelligence network which would eventually include two archaeological colleagues, Carl Blegen and Jack Caskey. Once in Athens, ensconced in the former Deutsches Archäologische Institut headquarters, Young is largely responsible for the establishment of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration in Greece, tasked with getting desperately needed supplies and support to the war-ravaged country. Young's intelligence focus was, of course, on communist groups, mainly AAM and Hellas, and here we find the very birth of Cold War espionage. The British at the same time exercised considerable interest in the political future of Greece as well. On October 9th, in 1944, in Moscow, at what is called the Tolstoy Conference, Churchill and Stalin made the Percentages Agreement, in which Southern Europe was carved up into spheres of influence, whereby broadly Stalin took Romania and Bulgaria, and the British Greece. This agreement, which wasn't made public until 1953 by Churchill in the final volume of his memoir, forced British troops into a horrific volte-face only weeks later. On the 13th of October, a token force of 3,000 British soldiers enters Athens. Papandreou's government would not return from Cairo for another 5 days, and formed security battalions, largely staffed by soldiers who had previously worked for the Nazi SS. In the total political control the British exercised, they increasingly edged out members of leftist political groups for military and administrative positions and actively promoted pro-monarchist conservative politicians. A peaceful demonstration in Syntagma Square turned violent on December 3rd and marked the beginning of the Dekmeriana, 37 days of violent clashes between leftist militias and the fledgling Greek government forces backed by British troops. Within weeks of German withdrawal, British troops were fighting in the streets of Athens against one of the most resilient anti-Nazi movements in Europe. It was yet again the leftists against the rightist royalists, socialism versus fascism, the polarizing struggle that had raged in Greek society since the early 1920s, except this time it was a thinly veiled proxy war between the USSR and Britain. In January of 1945, Edith Eccles, a former student of the BSA who had worked on Crete with Pendlebury and Hutchinson, arrives on Crete working for the UNRRA and sees Dunbabin at the Villa Ariadne. Also in January, the first official statement as to the condition of Knossos, along with other antiquities of Greece, is commissioned by archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley, lieutenant colonel working as an advisor for the War Office. The portion of the report concerning Crete is likely written by Dunbabin and states, quote, "The palace of Knossos and the surrounding ruins were protected by the Germans and are undamaged." In March of 1945, Tom Dunbabin sent to the BSA a report on the property at Knossos, which gives the first detailed description of the state of the site since liberation. It is precise and written with not only the eye of an archaeologist, but one with a grave concern for the conservation of the site. Quote, The winter has been exceptionally severe and has produced much more rain than normal. This has done minor damage to the palace and other remains, drains been blocked and walls collapsing. Also, the cement of the walls and terraces is weeping with bad effect on the gypsum blocks of walls and corridors. The most serious damage is in the area of the Queen's Megaron, where small stretches of the original wall have fallen. These are the north section of the east wall of the lavatory, south wall of the toilet, south of the court of the distaffs. These walls are about to be rebuilt with cement, and no structural damage appears to have been done. The temple tomb and forecourt twice filled with water, which has been pumped out. As there is a danger of heavy rains undermining the walls, one of two of the following measures should be taken: a glass roof put over the whole site, or a channel should be dug through the door of the forecourt in order to carry off the water. I can find no trace of any means by which the water was drained off since the excavations of the tomb. I propose to carry out the following work in the near future: weeding of the palace, rebuilding the collapsed walls of the palace, see above, hoeing of the crevatina vines in the north of the modern entrance of the palace, and wiring the property to prevent stock straying. Michael Akumianakis is temporarily carrying on care of the property until the curator returns. This lack of a curator on the site is a concern of Platon as well, who writes to the BSA dated March 9th. I have the honor to report to you that the condition of the antiquities at Knossos makes the presence of your curator there desirable. During the last 4 years, the ruins have suffered considerably, and the repairs which, in the absence of the curator, I myself have carried out, but could only be of an emergency nature and of temporary value. Since the preservation of the site of Knossos is your responsibility, I beg you to do your utmost to facilitate the return of the curator as soon as possible, since the damage sustained in the recent rains is greater than I can repair with my limited resources. We can surmise that Platon's concern for Knossos was shared with Dunbabin through a summative statement on the condition of Greek antiquities sent to the War Office dated April 11th. It states, the military liaison in Crete, who is Dunbabin, reported that the trustees of the museum at Heraklion had asked payment for repairs to the site and the museum, especially at Knossos. A limited quantity was being released for that purpose. Indeed, by May, the Villa Ariadne and the palace was Hutchinson returns to Knossos from Cairo in early 1945. By the end of the month, he reports to the BSA on the condition of the site. Oh, that's right. This is, yes. The palace in general seems to be in good condition. Not very serious trouble exists, though there are a number of minor repairs that might be executed, chiefly where gypsum plaques are concerned. Mr. Platon is very anxious that I examine personally the conservation work he has carried out at Malia, as he considers similar repairs would be beneficial to Knossos. The shrine of the double axe has had its entrance blocked by walling, but the vase on the ledge has been thrown down and broken previously. The entrance to the lustral area of the little palace has also been walled up by Platon, as have all the entrances of the various rooms containing the stratigraphic collection, except the entrance to the throne room. In a later report to the BSA at the end of Hutchinson's tenure in 1947, he gives us more information about the repairs, but also how important Platon had been to the preservation of the palace during the war. Quote, the British School in this is here. The British School of Archaeology at Athens owes a particular debt to Mr. Platon for saving its 2 houses at Knossos in fair condition, with some of the furniture and most of the archaeological library of the Villa Ariadne. The Palace of Minos itself has only suffered from neglect by the depredations caused by weather, military boots, etc., and has made it necessary to execute a number of minor repairs in November, December 1945. Some repairs indeed had been executed earlier by Mr. Platon during the occupation and by Colonel Dunbabin and Miss Eccles after the liberation of the area. In November and December 1945, with the assistance of Mr. Platon, I carried out more urgent repairs on the outside of walls, chiefly the gypsum pavements of the hall, the double axes, the throne room and its anteroom, the sanctuary complex south of the throne room, the west magazines, the southeast house, the corridor of the bays, and the kitchen area near the northeast magazine. Other repairs were executed in the south house and in the little palace, where the roof over the fetish shrine and the adjoining apotheke were badly damaged. There is, however, no photographic record of Knossos during these post-war years. However, an Associated Press photographer, Frank Noel, assigned to the Mediterranean after the war, records a view of the palace in 1946 from the south of the palace looking north. Unfortunately, we learn more about the estate than the palace in this photograph because of its vantage point. 1947 is a year of changes for Knossos. Indeed, Hutchinson proved to be the wrong curator at the wrong time. And he was more focused on new excavations and less on regular and essential management of the site. By May 1947, Piet de Jong is set to return to Knossos as its fourth curator. He is a welcome choice, as he has not only intimate knowledge of the site, having worked extensively there before, but he, of course, is an architect and entirely capable of working through more extensive repair work and restoration. His hiring well pleased the BSA director, John Cook, as reflected in a letter to Edith Clay, the school secretary, in May 1947. I can't say how delighted I am about Piet's appointment, and I'm kicking myself for not having thought of it. I'm sure that Knossos will now enter on the most brilliant phase of its career since the LM1 earthquake. For the Hellenic Republic, things were rapidly changing as well. In early 1947, Britain, without acknowledging this to the Greek government, informed the United States that it would no longer bear the burden of aid to Greece as well as Turkey, and would cease support at the turn of the fiscal year on April 1st, 1947. The Truman government, with a careful eye on the enduring power of leftist political parties in Greece and attentive to the recently minted Kennan policy of Soviet containment, stepped into the breach. The result, of course, was the Truman Doctrine, which the US president presents to Congress on March 12, 1947. The aid to Greece through the Truman Doctrine is the first time the US had funded a European nation with political intentions and, moreover, conducted entirely outside the framework of the United Nations. The Truman Doctrine marks the beginning of the Cold War, and Greece is one of its first theaters. In July of 1947, the US Congress authorized the American Mission for Aid to Greece, the AMAG, to appropriate some 428 million drachma, or 198 million of which was for military aid to continue to subdue socialist military actions. Dwight Griswold, former governor of Nebraska, was appointed chief of the mission and arrives in Athens with staff on July 15th. Lincoln McVeigh, American ambassador to Greece, and Prime Minister Konstantin Tsaldaris sign an agreement defining the purpose of the grant and conferring wide powers to the American mission. With speed, American advisors and administrators brought the whole Greek state apparatus under their direct control, openly maneuvering the Greek government and holding almost absolute control of the military, a quasi-American colonization. Importantly, however, more than half, $230 million of the 1947-48 AMAG aid was earmarked for non-military spending, focused on industrial and economic development, and its purpose was clear: to establish modern modes of production in Greece, which would boost her economy and her economic recovery and set the groundwork for a stable contemporary democracy. Some areas of industry were obvious: mining, electrification, a national cement industry, railway systems, roadway systems, and farming mechanization. A small cousin of these complex and expensive development projects was an interest in advancing the tourism industry in Greece. An essential first step in this advancement would be the restoration of her museums and antiquities. Indeed, in Hutchinson's last report to the BSA before he gives up the curatorship, there was the first indication of such funds coming from the Heraklion Museum via Platon. Quote, "The effort, Mr. Platon is busy on the repairs of the Heraklion Museum, which he hopes to reopen if he receives the necessary grants sometime in the spring of 1948. Earlier in the year in Athens, a broad and generous program was being developed for the repair and enhancement of Greek historical sites and museums. In March 1948, the Hellenic Board of Tourism publishes a study of the tourist industry for 1948 to 51 in English, clearly for the American audience who will fund it. In the study, some 240 billion drachma and 2.2 million, and these are all quoted in $48 and drachma, obviously. 240 billion drachma and $2.2 million for works at tourist localities is suggested, including archaeological sites and museums, and 37 billion drachma and $2.5 million for 3,000 new hotel beds. In the study, specific work at archaeological sites includes, quote, protection of the archaeological site by fencing it off, tree planting, toilet facilities, benches, in cooperation with the Archaeological Service, the construction of walking paths, permitting easy access to various monuments. 5 billion drachma, and $400,000 is suggested to set up the School of Tourism professionals and the tourist police. The first tourist locations proposed to receive aid for the development in 1948 were, there we go, sorry. Oh, no, there we have that, sorry. Were Athens, Epidaurus, Heraclion, Kos, Loutraki, Mycenae, Nauplia, Parnes and Rhodes, Sunion, and Phaleron. On a table listing the construction of tourist pavilions and tourist hostels, Festos is listed for funds in 1948 as well. Conspicuous is the lack of Knossos, already a well-known tourist attraction in Greece and certainly as attractive as Epidaurus and Mycenae. One can only conclude that Knossos is not mentioned because it is at the same time owned by the British school. And as Platon states in his letter of 1945, the costs for restoration and presumably tourist development will be carried by that institution. The Marshall Plan is passed in the US Congress in April 1948, and the AMAG is superseded by the Economic Cooperation Administration Mission to Greece, the ECAG, which continues the AMAG's development plans, including those aimed at the rejuvenation of post-war Greek tourism. At this time, more specific advice was extended on the restoration and improvement of archaeological sites and museums, but now from the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. In the same month, the Hellenic Board of Tourism publishes its study and recommendations. Oscar Bonnier, the acting director of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, prepared a detailed plan to renovate museums and archaeological sites and supporting the reestablishment of the Archaeological Service. Sections for proposed aid include 1, personnel required for the Archaeological Service, 2, rehabilitation of museums, 3, repairs and constructions of museum buildings and guardhouses, 4, restoration and preservation of monuments with costs for repairs. Rainier lists 23 principal sites for work. 3 are American, 6 are German, 6 are Greek, 1 is Belgian, 1 is French, and 6 churches. Curiously, no British excavation sites are among these. Nothing is suggested for the Mycenaean citadel, although the German and Greek excavated tombs were listed. Sparta, Palekistra, the Dictian Mars Cave, the Menelaon, Isthmia, Perachora, nothing. Knossos' exception is understandable as mentioned above because of its unique British ownership, but the absence of other British sites is conspicuous. Bonner's plan is submitted to Griswold with strong favor in June 29th, 1948. I have, as of yet, found no documentary evidence of its implementation, but it is known that these sites did undergo refurbishment around this time. In August of 1948, Carl Blegen is appointed director of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens and functions as a liaison between the Economic Cooperation Administration of the Marshall Plan and the Greek government. In this capacity, within this year, he writes a letter to the newly appointed ambassador of Greece, Henry Grady, urging support for the conservation of Greek antiquities and museums. Grady had come straight from serving as the US ambassador to India and had been appointed by Truman because of his prior work on the Allied mission for observing the Greek elections, the AMFOGE, in 1946. Blegen had also been a member of the Allied mission for observing the Greek elections and no doubt knew Grady. Something else Blegen and Grady may have shared was a frustration with what they saw as a lingering colonialist attitude among their British colleagues toward the Greeks. It has been argued in, for instance, Susan Allen's Classical Spies, American Archaeologists for the LSS in World War II, that Blegen, together with fellow American archaeologists Rodney Young, John Caskey, and Alison Friends, in their wartime OSS work, resented imperial attitudes among their fellow British intelligence officers. Certainly, Blegen's participation in the Allied mission for observing the Greek elections reflected at least a tacit support for US policy in Greece, which was opposed to the pro-monarchist stance of the British and in support of liberal ideas of democracy, popular sovereignty, and self-determination. Grady himself was a self-admitted anti-British imperialist, and his memoir reflects exasperation with British political policies in his diplomatic postings, including his tenure as ambassador to Iran, which followed his postings in Greece. In Blegen's letter to Grady, he highlights only 5 museums and sites: the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, the Acropolis Museum, Olympia, Delphi, and Heraclion, sites and museums associated with Greek, German, and French explorations. Indeed, it is not clear to what extent Rainier, Blegen, or Grady's views of British imperialism may have influenced the distribution of American funds, but it does go some distance in explaining an unbalanced selection of sites. and museums for tourist development. Meanwhile, apparently unaware of such high-level heritage policy overtures, de Jong is taking tasks in hand at Knossos and coming to terms with the full extent and cost of the conservation needed at the site. On September 10th, 1948, he reports, quote, "The palace repairs are going well. Yesterday, Marinatus came with Platon and seemed very pleased. I am quite sure that a really good job is being done, but it is costing more than I had reckoned. But once we really tackled the work, it becomes obvious that the damage shown on the surface bore no relationship to the concealed rotting away inside the blocks of gypsum. And as the cracks and holes inside were full of roots, they had to be cleaned out top to bottom. As a result, in order to do all I consider necessary, I have increased my staff of specialists from 2 to 4. The absolute necessary work is getting near completion, necessary to stand the winter, but I have still to pipe rainwater away from the piano nobile. This will cost about 500,000 drachma. There's also the problem of getting the water away from the hall of the column bases, room of the chariot tablets, and the court of the altar. But as these are ground level rooms, the water will have to be taken in half-round pipes. Although I've spent on the palace, not including weeding, which cost 1,212,000 drachma, the sum of 140 pounds at 30,000 drachma to the pound. I estimate that every year the cost will be 108 pounds, ordinary repairs, but not counting such projects as roofing the grand staircase or the area north of it, nor including the rush and rubber matting to cover the gypsum surfaces. Could I have some idea about the sum the committee would consider as a maximum, and also what they would consider sufficient? There are more important things to be done. A lot of work will have to be done on the limestone ashlar, which is crumbling, and in many cases, the whole face is splitting off. These figures are substantial against the war compromise budget of the British school. However, by late fall 1948, there was the first mention of Marshall Plan funds. In de Jong's curator's report from Knossos, he writes, "It is confidentially reported that 40 million drachma, 1,333 pounds, has been granted toward the repairs of the palace. This has not been confirmed, and the director is making inquiries." A letter from Edith Clay, the secretary of the school, to Sir John Meyer, president of the board of the British school, dated November 8, 1948, echoes this news of the funds, as well as some ignorance of their use. De Jong reports that Platon has just called, saying Knossos has been allocated 40 million drachma from the Marshall aid. De Jong did not know any details, but supposed Platon would pay the bills for the repairs of the palace. This will help us enormously. I did not realize that Marshall aid extended to antiquities. Meanwhile, we learned from a letter from Edith Clay to Edith Clay from de Jong, not only how important Platon is to the ultimate distribution of the Marshall funds, but he's already planning on the cash coming through. Dated the 28th of November, not having seen Platon again, I've not heard how the Marshall aid money comes, but I know that he has made an estimation for Crete and 40 million is for Knossos. When it will be available or under conditions, I do not know. I understood him to say that it has to be spent by next year. It is going to be a bit difficult to spend that sum unless we get going as soon as this kind of work cannot be done with a huge number of men. They must be specialists, and I know of only 4. Also, I have to keep my eye on the work, so that again means that you can't tackle too much at once. Still, the main thing is to get it. After all, I don't see how anyone in his senses can grumble, but I've not spent all the money. It doesn't make any sense. At the same time, in these times, what does? The existence of the funds and a discussion with Blagan is described with ambivalence by John Cook, director of the BSA, in a letter to Edith Clay, dated January 14th. If we have money from the Marshall aid funds, we might be able to embark on quite a lot of worthwhile things at Knossos. I spoke to Blagan about the palace. He sees no reason why the school shouldn't appeal for funds for repairs from the AMAG, allocation for archaeological purposes, and is willing to back us. Blagan's encouragement to apply for Marshall Plan funds is difficult to decipher. Was he trying to correct an earlier omission? Clearly, Cook is not in the loop as far as the AAMG policy on restoration of heritage is concerned, and there is no evidence that the BSA archive that Cook pursued AMAG support. But by February 1949, news of already allocated funds for the construction of tourist pavilions has filtered down to Knossos. In a letter dated February 4th from de Jong to Edith Clay, quote, "I had the most extraordinary letter from Platon the other day. I immediately went to see him and asked what was the source of it, thinking pressure must have been put on him from Athens. But he surprised me by saying that he himself had written it. It said that beautifying the entrance in the interest of the tourismos was not our liability. He replied that he thought that as the BSA was so rich, perhaps that they would like to expend 4 million drachma. I told him he was mistaken, whereupon he said, what about 1 million? Or if not, well, never mind, quote unquote, they would do it. It seems to me quite silly, and I have written to John not to treat it seriously. He has also got a similar letter. On the 14th of February, 1949, John Cook, in a letter to Edith Clay, reveals more about Blegan's ambivalent attitude toward the restoration of Knossos, the holdup of funds, and how central Platon was to finding a way to deal in the site. Quote, Piet has realized about the funds for repair. Piet has replied about the funds for repairs at Knossos. Apparently, Platon indented for money from the AMAG archaeological billion to cover repairs of the Cretan palaces, and Knossos is to have a whack. It is still a bit of a mystery since Carl Blegan, who vetted the whole scheme, thinks that the allocation, 250 million, I think it was, for Heraklion was solely for the museum. Unfortunately, however, the billion is mostly being diverted to the army and relief, and the latest is that only the Athenian museums will benefit from it. So we must hope for better luck next year. Piet does his best to agitate for the Marshall Plan funds on his own in Crete. In a letter dated July 12th, 1950 to Edith Clay, I am repairing walls which were getting very unsafe and stopping up holes in the antique masonry and other places before they get out of hand. You see, the spaces between the stones are really nothing but earth, which slowly crumbles away. And in many cases, the stones and blocks have either dropped or are ready to do so. At the moment, we are working down in the domestic quarter and have already made the place look very tidy, almost smart. There is a lot of this kind of repairing to be done, but I have 4 very good fellows, 2 of whom were employed this week. I have put the whole business to several of the Marshall people, and in a few days, one of the chief men's expected over, and I am going to tackle him with the fact that this is the mecca of all tourism to Crete and should have priority over rest houses and roads. I think that I shall be able to manage something in the end. You see, they have been here so many times, these ECA people, and nearly all have been entertained and shown around the site, but they're beginning to take an interest in our difficulties and point of view. By May, in a letter dated May 8th, 1951, the cash is almost at hand. In a letter from de Jong to Edith Clay, quote, the first thing I propose to do, once the money is actually in our hands, is to weed the whole site, then clean all the fallen earth, dust, and rubble from the oldest road, magazine and other walls, probably taking a lot of earth off the tops of many walls. Next, or perhaps the same time, if I can, make a new approach to the West Court, which is now over a concrete bridge at the artificial level of the court, which gives people the wrong impression. You see, money is no object now, as I am told that nothing worries the auditors in Athens more than to have money left over at the end of the financial year. They have no machinery to deal with it. Another work I am contemplating, and one which I have mentioned to either you or Sir John, is roofing the corridor of the bays in the Medallion Pythoi store next to it, which is all paved with gypsum and must be covered, not only to stop destruction by rain, but on account of it filling with water and emptying itself down the corridor at the top of the second flight of the grand stair. Then the shrine wants a flat roof putting on it to replace the present shoddy wood and Marseille tile one. A lot of repair is needed in the West Court and Central Court. This, however, is something which I have no intention to tackle at present. He would like to see a lot of the badly broken, decaying gypsum paving replacing with new gypsum slabs. But to do this, we shall have to find a contractor willing to start quarrying. Things are in full swing with the funds received by the end of June. In a letter dated June 29th, 1951, the palace has been weeded and the roots have been dug where near the surface, and the topsoil has been distributed, yet hasn't had a time to consolidate again. The result being that it has all been blown away. Of course, all the work has had to stop since breakfast time. He's describing a very windy day on the site. I went down at 8 a.m. with difficulty to find 2 tons of nice, quote unquote, Marshall sand, gradually getting less and less, and even small sea pebbles were going the same way. Platon was already there. He and I went to town to see how the engineer who makes the calculations for the new ferro concrete beams and roof covering the Medallion Pythoi was getting on. It looks as though the cost of the work, not counting the walls, which we shall build, will be at about 20 million. Of course, you realize that for the first time since the good old days of Sir Arthur, we think big. And you can judge the size of our aspirations when I tell you that the wage bill per week is 10 million drachma. The site has been weeded, almost finished, and several tasks are in hand in different places. I'm doing small excavations in the area of the altar, east of the stairs and the propylaeum, in order to repair the floor, walls, and doorway, which Evans has shown as 4, but now I make as 2 with a wall between. and 3 or 4 steps down each instead of a long line. I'm doing another exploratory dig at the end of the procession corridor to the left between it and the propylaeum, where odd stones, or perhaps not odd, make it difficult for visitors to enter the ruins that way. When I know more about it, I intend to take away fallen stones, expose what walls there are, and make a decent path through what has become the recognized way in. In the West Court, we have been digging around the large and small paving blocks to the depth of their thickness, and arsenic is being poured in. Then small stones will be packed into the joints. They will then be filled with santurino, a kind of cement, but looking more like mortar. The level of this will be finished in several centimeters below the surface of the slabs and will not be visible for long, as it will soon be filled with dust and look not at all. And look as though it had never been touched. All this to kill the weeds, stop them from growing at all, and prevent the slabs breaking at their edges, which fall into very wide joints. Many will be repaired. And continuing into July that year, in another letter from de Jong to Edith Clay, dated the 13th of July, de Jong gives some more details of the funds, Platon's role, as well as work accomplished. At last, I am able to have a day of rest indoors, having closed down work to the palace on account of having spent 69 of our 65 million. There was always something to worry over, settling one problem, always seeming to raise at least one more, especially in one area known as the court of the altar. The pavement, door jambs, and walls were fast dissolving and being kicked and broken up. The whole area of this court and the room north of it are under reconstruction, with the walls being built up about 2 feet high. The dark stone center has been put together and missing paving blocks added, and the surrounding gypsum paving is being relaid in white cement with joints cut, as I think it would have been in Minoan times. The room north of it will be tackled to finish when the second loan arrives. It is impossible to tell you the questions which arise, but I think we are doing it rightly, and to the satisfaction of Platon, who expresses his gratitude for what I've done at the close of our operations yesterday. You will be surprised if you could not see you would be surprised if you could see the Royal Road Evans discovered, the oldest road in Europe. It has been redug from end to end, and the sides have been scarped to where the sides have been scarped and we're undercut by water, and by the presence of loose and soft earth, we have built drywalling, all in line with the actual road slabs, thus getting a fairly straight line on both sides. At the modern road end, where there are steps going down, we have built dry walls on either side, curved to suit the change of direction, and will later guide a very low wall along the roadside to prevent the rainwater from the road pouring down and filling to the lowest level of the royal road with water. You now enter the West Court by the proper way, up the stepped ramp, and although we are still using it for the convenience of our workmen, we shall soon demolish the old bridge over which one used to enter the West Court. The paving in the West Court has been fortified, and the wide joints have had salt poured in to stop the weeds growing, and broken stones hammered, in which santurino cement put on top. This is at a lower level than the paving and colored like earth so that all looks quite natural. The paths across the court from the ramp have also been reconstructed. 25 square meters of synthetic gypsums plaques have already been laid, made of white cement and broken gypsum. The corridor of the bays is built up ready for the road, which will be made in ferro concrete without any interior supports. But as the cost of this will be over 20 million drachma, it will have to wait until the next installment arrives. I'm trying to get the sum of 100 million drachmas doubled. What good is 100 million to us? We only think in millions now. It is surprising how one's ideas of money change, especially when one sees how it is wasted on other jobs, officials and their equipment, cars, etc. You will have realized that the money has been given out to the Greeks, not to me, and that no part of the accounting falls to me. Also, the engaging of the workmen and buying of materials and appointment of the chief foreman is all in Platon's hands, both here and at Festos. But I have control of the work, and I have our Manoli as foreman or assistant. We have leveled the site in many places for the convenience of the tourists, filling in depressions with earth in front of the royal road and redigging around the retaining wall of the West Court and cutting in straight lines and banks into the crevattine. Several of the pre-palatial houses having been filled in to give walking space around the Colares, one of which, the most westerly one, will be built up to the court level, and the retaining wall of the court raised for 25 to 39 feet in length to the height Evans made it at the entrance, at the head of the stepped ramp. These last two letters from de Jong, in their description of the Marshall Plan afforded work, makes clear the full extent of the transformation in the early 1950s. Frustratingly, we have no photographs from this period or any detailed description of its execution. One has the impression that de Jong was working flat out and at his own discretion. sorry, that the free flow of Marshall Plan cash, but the free flow of Marshall Plan cash would not last long. After several years of building tensions, the Korean War explodes into active conflict in June 1950. As that conflict rapidly escalates, Marshall Plan funding was broadly cut in 1951 to afford the new war. In December of 1951, Paul Jenkins, ECAG deputy chief, informed the Hellenic Board of Tourism that from January 1952, tourism development would become almost exclusively a matter of Greek financing. This policy change is immediately evident in BSA archive correspondence. In a letter dated January 2nd from Lucy Talcott of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens to Edith Clay, quote, "We are distressed by the fact that the tourist program financed by the ECA has been cut off at the roots, and it is said that there will be no money forthcoming for any of the construction projects now underway. I suppose this includes the palace, as well as the National Museum and the Acropolis Museum, the latter now half torn down and looking fearful. Everyone hopes that some adjustment may be forthcoming for these three urgent undertakings, but thus far I have not heard of any practical grounds for such hopes." In a letter dated January 30th, 1952, from John Cook to Romilly Jenkins, the assistant director of the school, this fiscal circumstance vis-a-vis the Marshall Plan funds is confirmed. "We had a talk with the head of the American mission in Crete. He is very anxious to see the restoration of the palace begun this year brought to a completion and will do what he can. At the same time, I am doubtful whether it will be possible to get a decent allocation for Knossos this coming year because there's so very little for antiquities in the new budget, and it would be very difficult to arrange an exceptional allocation. In the last couple of years, an enormous change has been made in the appearance of the palace, thanks to Piet's attention and careful spending. What is now most needed is a roof on top of the new walls built in the area north of the grand staircase, with the extension of the central court up to the new construction, and the repainting of some of the most conspicuous copies of the frescoes. Above all, the paint on the walls of the throne room is in desperate state and really must be redone. The Tourismus has spent a lot of money on a new complex of guardian houses and reception rooms and a hypostyle path, which will carry vines on a trellis and make a rather nice entrance to the site. The Tourismus has now gone bankrupt, or virtually so, but fortunately, this setup was more or less finished in time. Indeed, 1952 was not only the year when Marshall Plan aid ceased to support conservation efforts at Knossos, it was also the year when the BSA transferred ownership of the entire estate to the Hellenic Republic. This transfer officially occurred on April 5th, and on this occasion, brief photographic documentation of the condition of the site was made, which gives us a record of de Jong's post-war work just after Nicolas Platon, just after completion. The keys, and here we have the three photographs. Really spectacular black and white photography. The keys to the site and the Villa Ariadne are transferred on that April day to Nicolas Platon, without whom untold damage could have occurred under Nazi occupation, and most likely de Jong's post-war restorations would not have been afforded. Indeed, these three scant photographs cannot do justice to all the work de Jong accomplished from 47 to 52 at Knossos. Made more clear in the correspondence I quoted above, and I cut a lot out, is the fact that hardly a single expanse of the site was not modified in some way by him. It is often said, and it is a very popular sentiment these days, that the restorations at Knossos are an expression of British colonialism. And certainly in their first iterations, there is a compelling argument for that. But as I hope I have clearly suggested here, the post-war restoration work of Piet de Jong is actually an expression of US Cold War policy and nascent American imperialism. It is hard to know exactly how de Jong's Knossian restorations fared immediately after his departure, but the photographic record here is helpful. Eric André, a 20th century American photojournalist, famous for, among other things, documenting the Great Depression in Germany in the late 1920s, the Berlin Olympics of 1936, the Spanish Civil War of 37, and the 1943 Allied bombardments in Hamburg, found his way to Knossos in 1954 while working for Der Spiegel. Among his often haunting images of the quiet walls and empty pithoi is one of a plan of the site. Nailed to boards, well worn from no doubt thousands of fingers, tracing the walls and halls, finding the way to the throne room or northern entrance passage. The plan is based on one found in Evans's publication of the site, The Palace of Minos, in volume 2, published in 1928. Itself a combination of two plans, one by Theodore Fife, the other Christian Dahl. the first two architects who worked at Knossos. The hanging of this plan was surely one of de Jong's embellishments, enabling an untutored visitor not only help in navigation, but an architectural view of the grand expanse of the palace, how much had been discovered and how much had been reconstituted for their wonder and pleasure. And this same plan is still used at the site today.
Thank you very much, Senta.
My pleasure.
Absolutely amazing.
You're very
Little
kind.
Bits and pieces. Now, I'm just gonna be sure which mic I can use. That's confusing.
No, not at-
Serious restoration.
Yeah, no, I mean, because indeed we only had so much time. I rapidly described and identified on the map the restoration work that indeed Theodor Feith and Christian Dahl had done, and then what de Jong does up to 1930. And those are substantial, absolutely. The two, roofing over of the medallion pithoi is one of the largest, absolutely brand new post-war restorations that get done. Most of the rest of his restorations is based on are improving, as it were, the prior restorations.
Next.
Please.
Thank you so much. Just brilliant. I learned so much. Thank you.
Please.
I had someone question, but when Alan's wife went to Egypt, did you take
This question was asked before in our little interim. I think he did. I don't, it's not clear to me. No one mentions him going back to the UK, and he brings her with him when he comes back. So, yes, she does. She does. Lucky woman. See, did she have a diary?
Hearing at the end about de Jong talking about the allocation for money as he goes through and it increases and then you deal with them, and he's talking about where it's being spent and the inefficiencies. Is there a tension between him and Platon? Does Platon get due credit, but is there a sort of rivalry there? Is Platon underappreciated by the non-Greek archaeologists on the site? And various questions there. But
I think, well, first of all, I think and I think he states as much, he's given a free hand. I think Platon gets him the aid, and I think that aid is basically peeled off the aid that was given to the Oracle Museum. And I think Platon gives that because he knows exactly what needs to be done. Because am I in the wrong? Okay, I should be speaking into this. I absolutely have not detected no discomfort between Platon and de Jong. I think it is underappreciated as we stand here today. I think it's underappreciated Platon's role in full stop, and then most especially during this period of time. I mean, Georgia Fluta's article in the annual is 100% worth the read. And she's talking about something slightly different, but makes clear that he unbelievably has little fear of the occupation force and will really go in there and try to shut stuff down. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. This is an extraordinary biography that is yet to be written. Oh, no. But this one's working. Okay, okay. Feels good to hold it. It's
So first of all, thank you so much for asking me the presentation. And I was just wondering on more general, general theme, how directly is the fact that money was actively being put in to rebuild the tourism industry related to the role that same industry played before the war?
before the war. Before the war. So the question is, your question is there an acknowledgement in the description of the rebuilding of the tourist industry, the nature of it prior to the war? There is. The record that I have sussed out through Marshall Plan officials, you know, is very frustrated with the quality of accommodations. There's actually a brilliant article about the new modernist style kind of hotels that are cultivated for these new tourist sites to be built alongside them. And and anyone who's traveled to Greece can identify one of these in a heartbeat, because they're all over the place. They're sort of churned out, but it's an interesting sort of iteration of modernist architecture. But there is a frustration that accommodations aren't up to Western standards. That is to say, aren't up to American standards. You know, toilet facilities are not up to standards to which most Americans are accustomed. Beds are not comfortable. There must be a restaurant in the museum. There must be a place to eat in museums, to me, in the hotel. So there, yes, there is a sort of recognition, and I know tourism. This seeding of a tourism industry doesn't just happen in Greece. It also happens in France. In fact, often France is used as a foil to Greece. Saying, well, I mean, there's a million reasons to go to France, but the Greeks have the beaches and the archaeology, and we've really got to capitalize on that and make sure that. So yeah, but I mean, wow. Obviously, I'm pretty much your average ill-educated American, and I knew not the outrageous span of the Marshall Plan. Unbelievable. And an overprocessed food too. It's like a plot. It's
I think that like the political implications are important in how these things are related. I'm gonna move close to you because they can
Please.
hear me off this mic. I'm gonna read out a couple of online.
Please.
Okay. One of them is about, could you please say something about the controversy over the quality of de Jong's restoration work, the artistic license he took with fresco restoration in particular, like the dolphin fresco, somewhat Art Deco style. Is that him we're seeing there? Actually, was part of my.
it's you know, it's partly him and it's partly Guilleron. And I think of course, as we see, right around the time that de Jong and Guilleron are creating these restorations, both two-dimensional and three-dimensional, the Art Deco style is in bloom now. And of course, there's a discussion about the sort of, shall we say, discursive relationship potentially between those two. However, as a couple of people have pointed out, when decades later, the site of Akrotiri on Thera is discovered, you find architecture that looks very Art Deco there, which makes you realize that actually Art Deco is borrowing more from what's found archaeologically than the other way around, which I think is an important point to make. That's sort of like a very straightforward, like terminus post quem there with the style.
And then this is Keith Raffin, and another one, he said, did you mention a book, Classical Spies?
Yes. Oh, this
Author?
is a must read.
Yeah.
Susan Allen.
Susan Allen.
Classical Spies. So it's what Rodney Young. Wow, is all I have to say.
Yeah, but
Wow.
I need to look him up now.
Unbelievable.
So I know very little about Rodney Young, but.
Yeah, you're gonna learn a lot.
So then, Colin McDonald, with our next questions, was it Platon or de Jong who removed the upper pillar of the grand staircase for structural reasons?
It was absolutely de Jong, and there
Oh.
is a whole course in the BSA corporate archives. There's a whole correspondence about this, which I had, and that was part of the stuff I cut out. But he almost as soon as he gets there, he says, "This is making me very anxious. This is very dangerous." He said, "I'm kept up at night worrying about it." And then he spends a tremendous amount of money bringing it down, because a whole sort of scaffolding has to be built to bring it down. And then he describes to Edith, I can't imagine how relieved I am. I didn't even tell you how really nervous I was about it. So it was Platon, and it was post-war.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then just a little follow-up from Colin, just to confirm that you had said that it was proposed to cover the gypsum slabs with rubber matting?
The slabs on the ground. So this is something that I didn't go into, but is really interesting part of the correspondence. So there's like a decade-long conversation about what to do about the gypsum. And of course, you have different challenges, whether the gypsum's on the ground or whether it's upright as a orthostate or a revetment, right? On the ground, obviously, the gypsum is being stepped on. And I think this was in one of the quotes, you forget that military boots had nails on them.
Yeah.
They don't have
Yeah,
anymore,
yeah.
but there you go. And you can imagine the sort of damage that does. And one of the suggestions actually that Platon makes, he says, I think I've found some sort of a workaround, and it involves the use of old tires. So it's some sort of rubber substance that's backed with a little bit of woven cloth. Old tires. We've also seen old tires. And he talks about, de Jong talks about trying to find someone in Athens to find them. Platon's going to get him, but it never sort of materializes. Another method that de Jong mentions he might want to try is just putting down wooden slats over the gypsum. But then he, before trying it, decides that this would be too dangerous, too cumbersome. But it's a perpetual challenge.
So it just, on that, like, are the most detail that you have found about the way he restored in these reports, or are there any other notebooks or
that I'm aware of? Not, it is here. And what I read, and it's these sort of, kind of casual kind of reporting correspondence he has mostly with Edith Clang. That, I did this today, and you could see he sort of repeats himself, and it's interesting. And there is this sense he's which I hope you got from what I read, that the money's coming quickly. He's got to spend it right away. He only has so many people he can trust. That's to say, assistants. It was, a nightmare project, right? And I think probably one of the last things on his mind is taking out the old line level and saying, hey, it's just get it done, which is very, very real, as they say, get it done.
Any other questions on the floor? Okay, we'd like to thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Yeah.